They arrived just after sunset. The sky was bleeding orange, fading into cold gray. The lake, stretched out like black glass, did not move. Not a single ripple, not a single sound. Jake drove slowly, the car's tires crunching against gravel. Olivia sat beside him, eyes fixed on the endless line of trees ahead. Neither of them spoke. The forest on either side of the road seemed to lean inward, listening. They hadn't been here in years. The cabin, small, wooden, and cracked with age, looked untouched but not in a peaceful way, more like it had been watching, waiting. Jake stepped out first. The air smelled damp, like something old had crawled out of the water and never dried. Olivia followed, hesitating at the steps. The boards creaked as she walked across the porch. Inside, it was dark, the kind of dark that doesn't go away even when you turn on the lights. The silence was heavy. No insects, no birds, not even the wind. In the corner of the living room stood something covered in a dusty sheet. Jake pulled it off, a shortwave radio, older than either of them, with a wire antenna coiled like a snake. "Guess it still works," he said. His voice sounded wrong in the room, too loud, too real. He turned the knob. Static poured out, dry, broken, like something whispering through sand. Then, for a moment, something else. A voice, just a whisper. Not a language, but close. Words that brushed the edge of understanding. Jake froze. Olivia leaned closer. Then the voice said, "You must not listen to the signal. It lives in the water." The room felt colder. Jake laughed nervously. Creepy old radio. Must be interference. But when Olivia reached to turn it off, the dial clicked by itself, and the sound stopped. Just silence. She looked at Jake. His face was pale, almost confused. Then he smiled, too wide. "Probably just a prank signal," he said. "These old things pick up anything." But that night, as they sat by the fire, the silence returned. The lake outside was still. The trees didn't move. And when Olivia looked out the window, she could have sworn something pale slipped beneath the water, watching. That night, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt watched. Olivia tried to sleep. She stared at the ceiling as shadows shifted across the wooden panels. The silence wasn't silence anymore. It was full of something, like the air itself was waiting. In the distance, the radio crackled. She had unplugged it, but it was on, just static. Then a voice, broken, stretched like a record melting in reverse. "He listens now." She shot upright. The radio, back in the living room, went silent again. Dead stillness. Jake wasn't in bed. Olivia grabbed a sweater and crept through the hallway, each floorboard groaning like something alive. The fireplace was out. The cabin was freezing. She looked through the front window. Jake was outside, standing at the very edge of the pier, barefoot, staring into the lake. The radio, the same one from the living room, sat beside him, lit from within. Its glow faintly pulsed like a heartbeat. She opened the door. Cold air hit her like a wall. "Jake?" she called. He didn't move. Only the static answered. She stepped out onto the porch, heart hammering. Her breath fogged the air. The lake didn't move. Then, quietly, Jake turned his head halfway toward her. "They said I belong here now," he whispered. His voice wasn't quite right, like someone else was using it. She didn't speak, couldn't. He turned back to the water. The radio hissed louder. Then, just like that, the glow inside it vanished, and Jake walked back past her, not saying a word, eyes unfocused, face blank. He left wet footprints behind him. Jake changed. It wasn't sudden. It was worse than that. It was slow, quiet, like something rotting under the surface, unnoticed until it was too late. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He just stared out the window at the lake for hours. He would sit in the same spot every day, the shortwave radio clutched in his hands even when it was turned off. Sometimes Olivia would wake in the middle of the night and find him sitting on the floor in the hallway, just sitting, eyes wide, listening. She tried to speak to him. He didn't answer. And when he did, it wasn't Jake. "It's warm beneath the water," he whispered once. "They talk to me when it's quiet." She tried to start the car. It wouldn't start. The battery was fine, the gas was full, nothing made sense. She packed a bag. She was going to walk. Even through the woods, she had to leave. But as she passed the living room, she heard the radio click on. She turned. Jake was standing in front of it, his body shaking. From the radio came only static, but it was screaming, somehow louder than anything she'd ever heard. Jake turned to her, his mouth opened, and he screamed, but not like a man, not human. The sound tore out of him like something was being pulled through his lungs from somewhere else. He collapsed. She ran forward, grabbed the radio, and smashed it against the floor. It shattered. Jake fell still. Silence. Then he opened his eyes. They weren't his. She couldn't find him the next morning. Not in the cabin, not on the pier, not in the woods. There were no footprints, no sound, no note. Just the lake. It was colder than before, still, black, smooth like obsidian. She stood at the edge of the water, whispering his name over and over, sometimes louder, sometimes screaming. But there was no answer. She stayed up that night, didn't sleep, couldn't. The fireplace was dead. The silence returned, deeper now, heavier, like something had settled inside the walls. And then light from outside, software, pulsing, blue. Olivia walked to the window. Out on the lake, not on but under, something glowed, moving slowly beneath the water, circular, rhythmic, as if breathing. She stepped outside. The air was wet and heavy. It clung to her. Her bare feet touched the wood of the pier. She walked. The light beneath the water stayed just beyond the dock. Then it moved, toward her, closer. And then it stopped. She leaned over the edge and saw him, Jake, below the surface, eyes open, face blank, watching her. He didn't swim, didn't float. He just hovered there, as if the water held him, preserved him. His lips moved, not words, not sound, just a shape, a message. Come down. She stopped sleeping. Every time Olivia closed her eyes, it was there, the lake, the sound, the signal. But worse than the dreams were the things that didn't go away when she woke up. Like the shape at the foot of her bed, it never moved. It never came closer, but it never left. She tried not to look at it. She told herself it was just the shadows, just the wood creaking. But it watched, and every night it was closer. First across the room, then by the door, then at the window, then beside the bed. She never saw it move, but one night she opened her eyes, and it was inches from her face. Not a person, not a ghost, just a presence made of static and lake water and silence. Its face, if it had one, looked like Jake. But the eyes were wrong. Too wide, too wet, too still. And behind them, a shape, something enormous, something that swam. And as she stared into it, frozen, it whispered again, "You don't have to be afraid anymore." She stopped asking questions. There were no answers, no logic, no escape, only the water. The lake no longer frightened her. It was quiet, patient, and it listened. She heard it now, not with her ears, but somewhere beneath thought. A low hum always there, always calling. Sometimes she would find herself outside without remembering how she got there. Once she woke up on the dock, barefoot, hands dipped into the water, fingers pale and numb. She wasn't surprised. It felt natural. One night she whispered, "What do you want?" And the lake replied, not with words, but with a feeling, like sinking slowly into warmth, like arms wrapping around her, like the end of a long ache. The next day, she found something on the shore, a dead bird, no wounds, just still. Its feathers soaked, its eyes open, in its beak, a shard of black plastic. She didn't touch it, she just looked at it, and the water behind it, and the soft ripples forming circles that grew and grew and grew. They never found her, only her shoes, placed neatly at the edge of the pier, only her coat folded like she was coming back, only the water still and black and waiting. Weeks passed, locals stopped fishing the lake, stopped swimming, stopped looking. They said the fog stayed longer now, that the trees whispered at night, that the static bled into other radios. But no one listened long, except for one. A boy, maybe 16, with a homemade antenna and a second-hand receiver. He wasn't looking for ghosts, just bored. He scanned frequencies late into the night, mostly static, sometimes music, until a voice, faint, female, familiar. "It's warm here." He froze. The signal wasn't strong. It crackled like breath in water. But the voice came again. "They see everything." From underneath, the boy turned the dial. More static. Then, "They're learning to speak." He tried to shut it off. The knob wouldn't turn. The volume rose on its own. The window beside him darkened, though the sky outside was clear. He heard footsteps, not in the room, below, dripping, slow. The radio screamed. For just a second he saw eyes in the reflection of the window, too wide, too wet. Not his. Then the power went out, and across every silent frequency in 100 miles, a single whisper echoed through the static. He lives in the water now, and he's waiting for more. And just like that, the lake went quiet. No signals, no whispers, no eyes in the static. The world forgot. Jake was a dream someone once had. Olivia, a glitch in an old tape. The dock rotted. The cabin stood empty. The trees stood still. Nothing moved. For a while. Then one day, on the edge of the horizon, a shape, a dusty SUV, music playing, windows down, laughter inside, a young couple, 2 children in the back. Vacation smiles, fresh air. No idea. They slowed near the lake. The mother leaned forward, pointing. The kids shouted. They saw a deer, or something that looked like one. The father turned the wheel. Gravel crunched under the tires. The water ahead was still, inviting, perfect. But just as the car crested the hill, the lake changed, only for a moment. A ripple, a shimmer, and then a face, half submerged, grinning. Olivia. Mouth too wide, eyes too calm. No bubbles, no breath, just watching, smiling, waiting. Then gone. The lake stilled. The air hummed, just slightly. And from deep below the surface, where light doesn't reach, the signal whispered once more. "Welcome back."